As we commemorate 250 years of American democracy, we celebrate an extraordinary national story, an experiment in self-government unlike anything the world had ever seen. As we reflect on those 250 years, I want to take you back to the start of that experiment, back to 1776. George Washington is exhausted after years of war, sacrifice, and service, first as the commanding general of the Continental Army, and then as our first president. He's ready to step away from public life. Before leaving office, Washington, with the help of two trusted aides, Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, writes what would become one of the most important documents in American political history, his farewell address. It's part reflection, part warning, and part plea to future generations. Among the dangers that Washington has concerns about, one stands out and rings out through the years: political partisanship. In his address, he warns us of the baneful effects of the spirit of party, having roots in being inseparable from our nature and rooted in the strongest passions of the human mind. In other words, tribalism, partisanship, division come naturally to us. Washington feared what would happen if we let those instincts dominate American democracy. He warned of the disorders and miseries that would result. He warned that that partisan spirit would agitate the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms and kindle the animosity of one part against another. Kindle the animosity of one part against another. Washington's deepest concern was not disagreement. Democracies thrive on disagreement. His concern was that we would begin to see ourselves primarily as members of political tribes rather than as citizens of a shared republic. Washington believed that if we surrendered to those instincts, the dysfunction and division that followed would threaten our democracy. And so he issued us a challenge, not just to politicians, but to citizens. He said that the common and continual mischiefs of the spirit of party make it the duty of a wise people to discourage and restrain it. Our duty to discourage and restrain it. George Washington warned that if we optimized our politics for partisanship, we would create a dysfunctional governing system, and that dysfunction would lead citizens to lose faith in our democracy. So let's fast forward to today and ask ourselves, how are we doing? To be clear, Americans have a lot to be proud of. Our democracy has endured 2.5 centuries of we've had civil wars, we've had economic depression, profound social transformation. Americans share many core values, but we also believe that something is deeply wrong. In a recent poll, 86% of Americans said they are exhausted by divisions in America. After economy, more Americans cited polarization and the state of our democracy as the greatest challenge facing our nation. Faith in institutions is steadily declining. Congress, for example, hovers at around a 15% approval rating. That's like friends and family level support. And honestly, who can blame people? Government shutdowns have become longer and more common than ever before. Congress has failed to pass a budget on time since the 1990s. Difficult but solvable problems like the mounting national debt go unaddressed year after year because of institutional paralysis. And here's the key point. This dysfunction is not the result of bad people or bad leaders. It's the result of bad incentives. We have allowed partisan actors to optimize our political system for partisanship, for nonstop partisan warfare, exactly what George Washington warned us against. In fact, in the engineering of our electoral system, we have essentially coded into the DNA of American democracy a gene for division and dysfunction. So where did we go wrong? In most states, it's a combination of three compounding problems. One, taxpayer-funded primaries that divide us into partisan camps before the first vote is even cast. Election rules that allow a candidate to win without a majority of votes incentivize division and bake a rigid two-party system into our politics. And partisan legislators that draw electoral boundaries to predetermine outcomes to benefit their own party. We have allowed devoted partisans to become the rule makers and referees of elections in which they are competing with predictable results. They have created a system in which the loudest and most rigid factions dominate our politics. In fact, only 8% of voters effectively determine the outcome of 90% of congressional races, and those voters tend to be the most intensely partisan. So politicians adapt rationally to the system in front of them. If cooperation is punished and vitriol is rewarded, then division becomes a political survival strategy, a self-reinforcing cycle of perpetual division. We have institutionalized partisanship deeply into our democracy and stretched it to the breaking point. So what do we do now? Well, since the problem is structural, the solution is structural. This is not about waiting for one perfect leader or one perfect election. It's about re-engineering the incentives in our election system. If systems can be designed to reward division, they can also be redesigned to reward cooperation. And here's the good news. America is an innovation nation. We pride ourselves on solving difficult problems through creativity, experimentation, and reinvention. We need to apply that same innovative spirit to our democratic institutions. Some states are already acting as laboratories of democracy. Take Alaska, for example. Alaska adopted a nonpartisan system in which all candidates compete in a unified primary on the same ballot, regardless of party affiliation. Multiple candidates then advance to the general election. And in the general election, Alaska requires a majority winner through an instant runoff process. That matters because when candidates must earn a majority of votes rather than simply a narrow partisan plurality, they are incentivized to appeal to a broader cross-section of voters. And politicians who must appeal to a broad coalition are more incentivized to work together to get things done once in office. Other states are exploring opening primaries to all voters and requiring majorities to win. There are federal laws proposed to require nonpartisan district drawing or even create multi-member districts. The goal of all these reforms is fundamentally the same: to create a democratic system that rewards cooperation and problem solving rather than nonstop division. And there are other ideas we should explore. As a recovering member of Congress, my personal favorite is simple. Congresspeople should not be allowed to fundraise for their campaigns until they pass and fund the federal budget for the year. You'd never see another government shutdown again. And here's another idea. No taxpayer-funded primary elections unless they're open to all voters. Now, when I talk about reform, people often say to me, Glenn, this is just how American politics has always been. But that is simply not true. In fact, reform and reinvention are among the most American traditions we have. Throughout our 250-year history, citizens have repeatedly examined the tenets of our democracy and worked to improve it. Reform is the norm. For example, secret ballot voting did not become widespread until the late 1800s. The first statewide direct primary election was in Wisconsin in 1904. Women's suffrage was not guaranteed until 1920. Louisiana adopted an open primary system with a majority requirement in the 1970s, with California and Washington State following along later. Arizona created an independent redistricting commission in 2001. Alaska adopted major electoral reforms as recently as 2022. The history of American democracy is not a story of static acceptance. It is a story of continuous renewal. Most of those reforms were difficult. They were contested. They required citizens willing to challenge old assumptions and imagine something better. And that brings us back to where we are today. There are two important lessons for this moment. First, America, we can do better. The entire 250-year arc of American history proves that. But second, the system will not fix itself. Standing on the sidelines is an endorsement of the status quo. Every major democratic reform in our history happened because citizens entered into a national conversation about what needed to change. They proposed ideas, and then they had the courage to put those ideas into practice. What better time than our 250th anniversary to join them? This can be an optimistic moment for our country, but only if we ask ourselves an important question. What responsibility will we take for the future of this democracy? How will we build upon the work of the generations that came before us, who cultivated this garden and renewed this democratic experiment? What imprint will our generation leave behind? Because if we succeed, if we choose to engage not as partisans but as Americans, we can put our democracy on a better path. We can heed the call of George Washington, and we can help ensure that future generations will be celebrating this extraordinary experiment 250 years from now. Thank you.